Get that crippled guard out of my boardroom. Sir, I work here. You work here. In that uniform, you smell like burnt coffee and failure. Julian hurled the forged bank statements directly at Marcus's chest. The papers exploded against his faded jacket and scattered across the marble floor. I built this company from nothing, and you thought you could steal from me and walk away. Marcus didn't move. He didn't shout. He just stood there leaning slightly on his bad leg. I didn't steal anything. Two corporate guards grabbed his arms and forced him toward the exit. Julian raised his crystal champagne glass, his platinum Rolex catching the overhead lights. The entire executive team watched in absolute silence. Not one person said a word. Marcus looked down at his cracked tactical watch and began,
Big mistake. He just framed an undercover special forces cyber expert for theft. Keep watching.
The fluorescent lights hummed, low, steady, indifferent. Marcus sat at his post, his broad shoulders hunched slightly over the security desk, his cracked thermos steaming beside a battered laptop. The lobby was empty. The marble floors gleamed cold and pale, reflecting nothing but his own faint silhouette. He liked these hours, the quiet ones, the hours before the building remembered it had a pulse. His bad leg ached the way it always did after midnight, a deep familiar throb that had lived in his left thigh since Kandahar. He didn't shift, he didn't wince. He simply breathed slow and even and kept his eyes moving across the 6 security monitors mounted above his desk. Nothing moved. Nothing ever moved at this hour. He clicked open his laptop. The screen was cracked along the lower right corner, a long diagonal fracture he had never bothered to fix. On it, a game of solitaire loaded. The cards were bright, simple, familiar. He dragged a red 7 onto a black 8. He dragged a black 3 onto nothing. He waited. The elevator at the far end of the lobby dinged. Marcus didn't look up. His fingers hovered over the trackpad, still patient. The elevator doors slid open. The sound hit first. Sharp, aggressive. The hard, violent click of Italian leather shoes striking cold marble. Each step was deliberate, unhurried, loud in the way that only truly arrogant men allow themselves to be loud. Marcus recognized the sound. He had heard it before. Julian Hartwell, Chief Financial Officer, walked as though the floor owed him something. He crossed the lobby with his jacket slung over one arm, his platinum Rolex catching the overhead light in a brief, blinding flash. He was on the phone. He was always on the phone. No, I don't care what the compliance window says, Julian said. His voice filled the lobby, smooth and cold. Move the transfer by Friday, all of it. He didn't look at Marcus. Men like Julian never looked at the guard. Marcus watched him cross the lobby in one steady peripheral glance. He kept his eyes on the solitaire cards. Julian stopped. He dropped his jacket onto the corner of Marcus's desk without slowing his pace. He knocked the cracked thermos sideways with the back of his hand, deliberately carelessly, the way a man knocks over something that belongs to someone who doesn't matter. The thermos lid popped. Warm coffee spread slowly across the desk, soaking into a folded notepad, curling the edges of a printed access log. Marcus didn't move. Julian was already walking away. Clean that up, he said into his phone. He wasn't talking to Marcus, or maybe he was. It didn't matter to Julian either way. Marcus set the solitaire card down. He looked at the spilled coffee. He looked at the retreating back of Julian's custom silk suit, the fabric so precisely cut it moved like water. He reached for a paper towel. He pressed it flat against the spill, slow and deliberate. His jaw was still. His breathing was still. His eyes, dark and unreadable, tracked Julian's reflection across the polished lobby floor until the man disappeared into the executive elevator. Chloe appeared 3 minutes later. She emerged from the stairwell in a cloud of expensive perfume, her heels precise and rhythmic on the marble. She was Julian's executive assistant, sharp-faced, immaculate, the kind of woman who had built her entire personality around proximity to power. She glanced at Marcus as she passed. The glance was brief, dismissive, the kind reserved for furniture. "You missed a spot," she said without slowing. She was pointing at the edge of the desk where a thin line of coffee had dripped onto the floor. She didn't wait for a response. She never did. Marcus looked at the spot. He crouched slow and deliberate on his bad leg and pressed the paper towel to the floor. The old wound in his thigh pulled tight. He breathed through it steady. He had crouched in worse places, in darker places, in places where the sound of footsteps meant something very different from arrogance. He stood. He returned to his chair. He looked at the laptop screen. On it, the solitaire cards sat exactly where he had left them. He reached for the mouse. His finger rested on the trackpad for exactly 2 seconds. Then he tapped a key. Once. Quietly. The bright, simple solitaire cards dissolved. In their place, cascading lines of encrypted green code filled the screen, dense and rapid, scrolling downward in silent, purposeful streams. Data. Real data. Financial architecture system, pathways, account structures buried 6 layers deep inside Novatech's mainframe. Marcus watched it the way a surgeon watches a patient's vitals. Calm. Focused. Seeing everything. Then he tapped the key again. The green code vanished. The solitaire cards returned. He picked up his cracked thermos. He took a slow sip of what remained. The lobby was silent again. The marble gleamed. Julian's expensive shoes had left no mark on it. They never did. That was the thing about men like Julian. They believed that invisible meant harmless. They believed that quiet meant empty. They had never learned the difference between a man who had nothing to say and a man who was simply waiting for the right moment to speak. Marcus looked at the elevator doors. He looked at the monitors. He looked at the cascading encrypted code that only he could see and only he could read and only he could use. He picked up a red queen. He placed it on a black king. He waited. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. Marcus heard it before anyone else did. Not the call itself, the silence before it. The particular pressurized silence of a building that has just discovered something is wrong. He was still at his desk. His thermos was empty. His bad leg was stiff. The overnight log sat open in front of him, half filled in his careful, unhurried handwriting. Then the executive floor erupted. Voices first, sharp overlapping, controlled panic dressed in professional language. Then footsteps, then Julian. Julian came down the stairs rather than the elevator, which told Marcus everything. Men like Julian took elevators. They took elevators because elevators were a performance, a vertical stage for their entrance. When Julian used the stairs, something had rattled him badly enough to make him forget the performance. He hit the lobby floor fast, his platinum Rolex catching the morning light, his silk shirt slightly open at the collar. His jaw was set, his eyes were moving. "Get me building security," he said to no one in particular. Then he looked at Marcus. For the first time, he actually looked at him. "You, come with me." Marcus closed the overnight log. He capped his pen. He stood slowly, deliberately, his bad leg taking a half-second longer than the other. Julian was already moving toward the conference room. Marcus followed. He kept his pace even, unhurried. The conference room smelled of cold coffee and recycled air. 4 executives were already seated, pale-faced and rigid, their laptops open. Sarah from internal compliance stood at the far wall with her arms crossed. Chloe hovered near the door, her expression arranged into careful, practiced concern. Julian stood at the head of the table. He straightened his cuffs. He cleared his throat. $14 million, he said flat and clean, is gone from the offshore reserve accounts. Transferred out, sometime in the last 72 hours. The room held its breath. Julian let it hold. He was good at this. The theatrical pause, the controlled delivery, the strategic management of shock. He had the practiced stillness of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times in private in front of a mirror. "I want every access log audited," he said. "Every keycard entry, every file transfer. I want to know who touched those accounts." His eyes moved around the table. Slowly, deliberately. They landed on Marcus, who was standing near the door with his hands clasped in front of him, his faded uniform creased from the overnight shift. "Starting with non-executive personnel," Julian said. The word landed the way he intended it to, a blade clean and quiet. Chloe looked at Marcus. Her expression shifted, a small, private flicker of satisfaction there and gone in less than a second. The executives followed Julian's gaze. Marcus looked back at them. His face was still, his breathing was slow and even. He did not look like a guilty man. He did not look like an angry man. He looked like a man who was listening very carefully and remembering everything. Julian walked to Marcus. He stopped close enough that his expensive cologne reached Marcus first. Heavy and sharp, the particular scent of a man sweating beneath a very costly exterior. He looked Marcus up and down slowly, the way a man examines something he has already decided has no value. "Empty your pockets," Julian said. His voice was quiet now, more dangerous in its quietness. "Sir, your pockets." Julian's voice did not change, smooth, unhurried, enjoying itself. "Routine security protocol for all non-executive personnel." He turned to the room. "Isn't that right?" Nobody disagreed. Nobody ever disagreed with Julian in a room where Julian controlled the temperature. Chloe straightened slightly near the door. Marcus looked at Julian for exactly 3 seconds. Then he reached into his left pocket. He placed a folded paper towel on the table. He reached into his right pocket. He placed a stick of gum, a pen cap, and a worn brass coin on the table beside it. The brass coin was old, scratched at the edges, the kind of military challenge coin that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't earned the right to carry one. Julian glanced at it without recognition. He looked back at Marcus. And the jacket. Marcus unzipped the security jacket. He laid it on the table. Julian reached into the inside pocket himself, which was a calculated choice, a deliberate performance of dominance. He found nothing. Nothing except a burner phone. Black, cheap, unremarkable. Julian held it up. "Whose is this?" "Mine," Marcus said. "Personal device. Policy allows it." Julian turned it over in his hand. His expression was controlled, but something moved behind his eyes. Calculation. A small, private adjustment. He set the phone down on the table. He stepped back. He straightened his cuffs again. "Fine," he said. He turned to the executives. "I want the audit completed by noon. If anyone has information regarding the missing funds, my door is open." He was already moving toward the exit. Chloe swept after him, her heels sharp on the floor. The executives began talking low and urgent among themselves. Marcus picked up his jacket. He picked up the brass coin and slid it back into his pocket. He picked up the burner phone. His thumb moved to the screen. Quietly, precisely. He typed a 10-digit sequence. The screen confirmed receipt with a single silent green pulse. Then he pocketed it. He picked up the folded paper towel. He put it in the trash. He walked back to his desk in the lobby, settled into the chair, and opened the overnight log to the page he had left. He uncapped his pen. He wrote the time. He wrote the date. He wrote nothing else. The building moved around him, urgent and afraid voices rising and falling behind glass walls. Julian's cologne still hung in the air of the conference room. Marcus could smell it from the lobby. Sweet, expensive, beneath it if you knew what to look for, something sharper, something acidic. The particular smell of a man who had done something irreversible and was only now beginning to understand the weight of it. Marcus looked at his laptop screen. He looked at the solitaire cards. He did not touch them. He simply sat still and patient and watched the building he had been paid to guard tear itself apart, looking for a thief it would never find. Not today, not yet. Not. The basement level of Novatech smelled of concrete and old wiring. It was the kind of smell that existed below the reach of the building's carefully managed aesthetic, below the marble and the climate control and the curated silence of the executive floors. Down here, the ceiling was low. The lights were fluorescent and unforgiving. The lockers were metal-dented, painted once in institutional gray and never again. Marcus's locker was number 41. It was assigned to him on his first day along with a laminated access card and a photocopied sheet of building protocols that nobody had updated since 2019. He had put nothing personal in it except a spare uniform shirt, a travel-sized bottle of ibuprofen, and a small flat tactical camera no larger than a shirt button magnetized to the inner ceiling of the locker angled precisely at the door. He had placed it there on his third night, quietly, without announcement, the way he did most things. It was 11:43 in the morning when Julian came down. Marcus watched it happen on his phone. The feed was small, the image slightly grainy in the fluorescent light, but clear enough for everything that mattered. Julian came alone. That was the first thing Marcus noted. Men like Julian rarely went anywhere alone. They traveled with assistants, with lawyers, with the ambient weight of other people's attention. Alone, Julian looked different, smaller somehow, more deliberate. He was carrying a manila envelope, thick, sealed, the kind that held physical documents rather than anything digital. He moved through the locker room with his shoulders slightly forward, his eyes moving left and right, his expensive shoes completely silent on the concrete floor. He had changed them. The Italian leather had been replaced with rubber-soled trainers, dark and nondescript. Julian had thought about this. He had prepared. Marcus watched him find locker 41 without hesitation. That was the second thing he noted. No searching, no checking numbers. He had known exactly where it was before he came down. Julian looked at the locker. He looked at the combination lock. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded slip of paper. He unfolded it. He read from it. He began working the combination. His hands were steady. His face was focused, the same face he wore in board meetings, controlled and certain and completely without doubt. The lock clicked open on his third attempt. Julian pulled the locker door. The hinges were old and poorly maintained, and they screamed. The metallic grating screech of corroded steel filled the small locker room, sharp and raw, bouncing off the concrete walls and the low ceiling. Julian flinched. He looked over his shoulder. The room was empty. He was alone. He turned back to the locker. He took the manila envelope in both hands. He pressed it into the back of the locker behind the spare uniform shirt flat against the metal wall. He smoothed it down. He adjusted the shirt to cover it. He stepped back. He looked at his work for exactly 4 seconds. Then he swung the locker door shut. The hinges screamed again. He replaced the combination lock. He spun the dial. He put the slip of paper back in his jacket pocket. He straightened his collar. He rolled his shoulders once the unconscious physical adjustment of a man resettling a weight he has decided to carry. Then he walked back toward the stairwell, his rubber-soled shoes silent on the concrete, his envelope gone, his hands empty, his expression already rearranging itself back into the smooth executive composure he wore on every other floor of this building. Marcus watched until Julian's back disappeared through the stairwell door. He set the phone face down on the desk. He picked up his cracked thermos. He took a long, slow sip of cold coffee. He set it down. He looked at the marble lobby floor, pale and gleaming and indifferent, and he thought about the manila envelope pressed behind his spare uniform shirt, and he thought about Julian's hands, steady and certain, and he thought about the slip of paper with the combination written on it, which meant Julian had obtained that combination from somewhere, which meant someone in building administration had helped him, or someone had been careless. Or Julian had simply taken what he needed, because men like Julian had never been taught that some things were not theirs to take. He could have stopped it. That was the thought that sat in the room with him, quiet and heavy. He had watched the entire act on a screen smaller than his palm. He had watched Julian force open his locker, watched him plant the envelope, watched him leave. He could have been in the basement in 4 minutes. He could have been standing in that locker room when Julian arrived, badge in hand, and it would have been over before it properly began. He did not go. He stayed at his desk. He drank his cold coffee. He let Julian dig. There was a reason for that. There was always a reason, even when the reason cost something. Even when the reason meant sitting very still while someone built a cage around your name and bolted it shut from the outside. The reason was evidence, not the kind that could be argued with. Not the kind that could be reframed or dismissed or buried under enough money and enough lawyers. The kind that left no room. The kind that closed every door at once. Marcus looked at his phone. He looked at the small clear feed from locker 41. He looked at the timestamp burning in the corner of the screen. He looked at the evidence pristine and complete and entirely his recording itself patiently into a secured server 3 states away. And he thought about Julian upstairs right now, straightening his cuffs, resuming his performance, believing with absolute certainty that he had just solved his problem. Marcus set the phone down. He picked up the solitaire cards on his laptop screen. He placed a blackjack on a red queen. He placed a red 10 on the blackjack. Outside the lobby doors, a delivery driver in a gray uniform pushed through the entrance, a cardboard tray of coffee cups balanced in one hand, a clipboard in the other. He was heavy-set, unhurried, wearing the anonymous expression of a man who delivered things to buildings like this 12 times a day and had stopped seeing them years ago. He stopped at the security desk. He set the tray down. He slid the clipboard toward Marcus without making eye contact. "Sign here," he said. Marcus looked at the clipboard. He picked up the pen. He signed. The delivery driver lifted one coffee cup from the tray and placed it separately on the desk, apart from the others. It had a red lid, distinct, deliberate. "That one's yours," the driver said. He picked up the tray. He picked up the clipboard. He walked back through the lobby doors without looking back. Marcus looked at the cup with the red lid. He looked at the lobby doors closing behind the driver. He looked at the security monitors above his desk, each one steady and quiet, and showing nothing but empty corridors. He reached out. He wrapped both hands around the cup. It was warm. He held it for a moment still, his broad hands steady, his bad leg aching beneath the desk. The basement 2 floors below him. Julian somewhere above him, and between them, in this quiet lobby, in this ordinary cup, something that changed everything. He did not open it. Not yet.
Wait. No way. He just planted fake offshore bank accounts in a veteran's locker to cover his own theft. If that were me, I would have dragged him out of that basement by his custom suit. Imagine serving your country, only to come home and have a greedy executive try to steal your freedom for a few extra millions. The audacity is real.
He set it carefully to one side of the desk. He straightened the overnight log. He uncapped his pen. He wrote the time. He wrote nothing else. He waited. The board meeting was called for 2 o'clock. Marcus knew it was coming before the calendar notification went out. He knew it the way he had learned to know things in places where being wrong about what was coming next had permanent consequences. He knew it in the particular quality of the silence on the executive floor, in the way Chloe's heels moved faster than usual above him, in the way Julian had not come down to the lobby once since returning from the basement. Preparation had a sound. Marcus had spent enough years listening for it in the dark to recognize it anywhere. He was at his desk at 1:58 when the internal phone rang. "Security to the boardroom," the voice said. "Immediately." Marcus capped his pen. He stood. He straightened his faded uniform jacket. He picked up nothing. He left the coffee cup with the red lid in the locked lower drawer of his desk where he had placed it carefully that morning, and he walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor and rode up in silence, his bad legs steady beneath him, his breathing slow and even and controlled. The boardroom was full. Every executive seat was occupied. Legal was present, 2 attorneys in dark suits sitting against the wall with identical leather portfolios open on their knees. Sarah from Internal Compliance stood near the window. Her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. Chloe stood beside Julian at the head of the table, her posture straight, her face arranged into the particular expression of a person who knows exactly what is about to happen and has decided to enjoy it. Julian stood at the head of the mahogany table. His suit today was darker than usual, charcoal precise, authoritative. His Rolex caught the light every time he moved his wrist, which he did often deliberately. He looked at Marcus when Marcus entered. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he has already decided the fate of. "Close the door," Julian said. Marcus closed it. The latch clicked. The room was very quiet. Julian reached beneath the table. He produced the manila envelope. He held it up for the room to see, turning it slowly, unhurried, theatrical. This, he said, was found in a security locker on the basement level. He set it on the table. He opened it. He drew out the documents inside crisp, thick, official-looking and laid them flat on the mahogany surface for the executives to see. "Offshore bank records," Julian said. "Accounts registered under a shell entity. $14 million moved in 3 separate transfers over 6 weeks. He paused. He let the room process the number. He was very good at pauses. "The locker belongs to our overnight security guard." Every eye in the room moved to Marcus. Marcus stood near the door. His hands were clasped in front of him. His face was still. His bad leg ached with a deep, familiar persistence that he breathed through quietly. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Julian. He said nothing. "I want an explanation," Julian said. His voice was measured quiet, dangerously reasonable, the voice of a man performing restraint for an audience. "Sir," one of the attorneys said, leaning forward, "we should follow protocol before any accusation." "The evidence is on the table," Julian said. He did not look at the attorney. He kept his eyes on Marcus. $14 million in documents in your locker. Explain that." The room waited. Chloe's expression was perfectly composed, bright-eyed, attentive, the expression of a woman watching something she had been promised and was finally receiving. Marcus looked at Julian. He looked at the documents. He looked at the attorneys against the wall and at Sarah near the window and at the 12 executives seated around the mahogany table in their expensive chairs. He looked at his own reflection, faint and distorted in the polished surface of the table. He said nothing. The silence stretched. Julian let it stretch. He was enjoying the silence the way he enjoyed most things, as a demonstration of his own power, as evidence that the room moved at his tempo and no other. Then Julian nodded once, a small, decisive motion. "Remove his badge," he said. One of the corporate security guards, a broad man in a black jacket who had appeared from somewhere near the wall, stepped forward. He reached out. He unclipped the security badge from Marcus's chest. The plastic click of it was very small in the large, silent room. The guard stepped back. Julian looked at Marcus's chest where the badge had been. He looked at Marcus's face. He looked at the faded uniform jacket and the scuffed steel-toed boots, and the slight permanent lean of Marcus's weight on his good leg. And something moved through Julian's expression, a brief, bright flicker of pure satisfaction, clean and uncomplicated, as a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted and is tasting it. "Get him out," Julian said. The 2 corporate guards moved. They were not rough. They were precise, which was worse. Each one took an arm firmly and turned Marcus toward the door. Marcus did not resist. He did not pull. He did not say a word. He allowed himself to be turned. He allowed himself to be walked toward the door. He allowed the room to watch. As they moved him past the table, his eyes moved down to his left wrist, to his tactical military watch, matte black, scratched at the bezel entirely without the gleaming ostentation of Julian's Rolex. His eyes moved to the seconds display. He looked at the number. He looked at it without expression. He counted, quietly, entirely inside himself. Precisely. Behind him he heard Julian lift a crystal glass. He heard the particular delicate sound of champagne being poured. He heard Chloe say something low and approving. He heard the soft, self-congratulatory laughter of a man who believed completely and without reservation that the game was over. The boardroom doors closed behind Marcus with a heavy final sound. The corridor outside was empty and fluorescent and very quiet. The 2 guards held his arms and walked him toward the elevator. Marcus looked straight ahead. His bad leg moved steadily beneath him. His breathing did not change. His jaw was still. His eyes were calm and dark and counting. They put him in the holding room on the 2nd basement level. It was a small room. concrete walls painted once in institutional white and now the color of old bone. A single metal chair, a single fluorescent tube overhead buzzing at a frequency designed, it seemed to make thought difficult. A reinforced door with a digital keypad on the outside. No windows, no table, no concession to the idea that the person inside was anything other than a problem to be contained. Marcus sat in the metal chair. He set his hands on his knees. He looked at the wall opposite him, and he breathed, in, out, slow, even. The air conditioning vent in the upper corner of the room rattled with a thin, persistent shudder, pushing cold air down at a temperature that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with institutional indifference. The cold found the old wound in his left thigh immediately. It always did. In cold rooms, in damp places, in the pressurized cabins of transport aircraft at altitude, the wound remembered itself. It pulled tight along the scar tissue, deep and insistent, a language his body had developed for a specific and private conversation about things that had cost him more than he had expected to pay. He breathed through it. He had been breathing through it for 11 years. The door opened. Julian came in alone. He was still in the charcoal suit. His Rolex caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in a way that seemed almost aggressive in the small, bare room. He was carrying his phone in one hand, face out, screen bright. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Marcus in the metal chair with his hands on his knees and his bad leg extended slightly, and his faded uniform jacket still on, still creased from the overnight shift. Julian smiled. It was not a cruel smile. That was the particular thing about it. It was a satisfied smile. The smile of a man who had solved a complex problem and was now simply reviewing the solution. He walked in. He let the door close behind him. He crossed to the center of the room and stood there and looked at Marcus the way Marcus had watched him look at quarterly earnings reports with the calm proprietary pleasure of a man reviewing numbers that belonged to him. "I want you to understand something," Julian said. His voice was easy, conversational, almost kind. He held the phone up. On the screen, Marcus could see a banking interface, an account balance. The number had 11 digits before the decimal point. "This," Julian said, "is where the 14 million went. And then some." He turned the screen so Marcus could see it more clearly. He wanted Marcus to see it clearly. That was important to him. The seeing. "You've been a useful prop," Julian said. "Genuinely. The limping security guard with the cracked laptop. Nobody looks twice at someone like you. That's the beauty of it." He pocketed the phone. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked around the small concrete room with the expression of a man who has never once imagined himself inside one and cannot quite believe that other people actually end up here. "The FBI will be here in the morning," Julian said. "The documents are real enough to hold you for 72 hours minimum. By then, the transfers will be beyond reach." He looked at Marcus one more time. Top to bottom, the boots, the uniform, the still hands on the still knees. "Nothing personal," Julian said. He turned toward the door. Marcus looked at the wall. He looked at the institutional white paint yellowed at the corners and the buzzing fluorescent tube above him and the cold concrete beneath his boots, and he breathed in slow and deliberate, and he thought about a thing his commanding officer had told him once in a different kind of small room, in a different kind of darkness, in a place where the walls had been dirt rather than concrete, and the cold had been the cold of a mountain rather than a machine. Patience, his CO had said, is not the absence of action. It is the discipline of choosing the exact right moment for it. Julian was at the door. His hand was on the keypad. Marcus looked down, slowly, quietly. He reached into the inside pocket of his faded uniform jacket. His fingers found the coffee cup, not the cup itself, the bottom of it. The false bottom, thin and precisely fitted, which he had peeled away in the locked drawer of his desk that morning before the board meeting, before the guards, before the charcoal suit and the mahogany table and the sound of champagne being poured over his professional destruction. Inside the false bottom, fitted into a molded recess no larger than his thumbnail, was a thumb drive, matte black, unmarked, smaller than a key fob. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. He looked at it. The delivery driver had not been a delivery driver. The coffee cup had not been a coffee cup. The red lid had not been a color choice. Every piece of this had been moving toward this room, toward this moment, toward this specific and necessary point at which the only remaining question was how. Julian let the door close. His footsteps receded in the corridor, unhurried, fading. Marcus listened until they were gone. Then he looked at the digital keypad on the door. He looked at the thumb drive. He looked at the keypad again. He thought about the building's mainframe architecture, which he had been mapping quietly, patiently from his cracked laptop over 11 weeks of overnight shifts while Julian walked past him every evening and never once looked at the screen. He thought about the access layers, the security protocols, the administrative override pathways buried 4 levels deep in the building's digital infrastructure, patient and waiting like every well-placed thing. He thought about the 10-digit sequence he had typed into the burner phone in the lobby 2 days ago, while Julian watched him empty his pockets while Chloe smiled from the doorway. He thought about what that sequence had done, where it had gone, what it had prepared. Marcus stood. The metal chair scraped against concrete. His bad leg straightened slowly, the cold pulling along the scar tissue, insistent and familiar. He stood at his full height in the small white room, and he looked at the door, and he looked at the keypad, and he looked at the thumb drive between his fingers, matte, black, and precise, and exactly where it needed to be. He crossed to the door. He stood before the keypad. He looked at the port along its lower edge, the auxiliary input standard across every keypad in the building installed for maintenance access, and never once considered by anyone as a vulnerability, because nobody had ever thought to look at the overnight security guard long enough to discover that vulnerability assessment was among the many, many things he was quietly, lethally good at. He raised the thumb drive. He held it at the port. He paused, not from hesitation, from precision, from the discipline of the exact right moment. Then he pushed it in. The keypad blinked once. Green. Then the building died. Not all of it. Not the lights, not the elevators, not the surface systems that kept Novatech looking like a functioning, respectable institution. The deeper systems. The ones nobody thought about because nobody needed to think about them. The access control layer, the internal lock network, the digital barriers between rooms, between floors, between the man in the concrete holding room and the rest of the building. They dropped, silently, all at once. The door clicked open. Marcus pulled it. He stepped into the corridor. The fluorescent lights above him burned on, indifferent. The corridor was empty. He stood for a moment still and straight the thumb drive in his closed fist, his bad leg steady beneath him, the cold from the holding room still sitting in the scar tissue of his thigh. He breathed once, then he walked. He took the stairwell rather than the elevator. 4 flights. Steady and unhurried, his steel-toed boots quiet on the concrete steps, his hand not touching the railing. He had climbed worse stairs, in worse buildings, in places where the wrong sound on a stairwell had consequences that made tonight look like a conversation. He reached the executive floor. He pushed through the stairwell door. The corridor outside the boardroom was empty. Through the tall glass panels flanking the boardroom doors, he could see them. Julian at the head of the mahogany table, jacket off, now his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, relaxed in the particular way of a man who has stopped performing because he believes the audience has gone. Chloe beside him laughing at something, her posture loose and unguarded. 3 remaining executives scattered around the table with open laptops and half-empty glasses. The champagne bottle was on the table. It was mostly gone. Julian was pouring the last of it into his crystal flute, tipping the bottle with the easy, proprietary confidence of a man who owned everything in the room, including the air. Marcus looked at the boardroom doors. He looked at his reflection in the glass panel beside them. Faded uniform jacket, scuffed boots, no badge. The same man who had been walked out of this room 2 hours ago by corporate guards stripped of his credentials, escorted to a concrete box in the basement and locked inside it. He looked at that man for exactly 2 seconds. Then he pushed the doors open. The room turned. Every head, every eye. The sound of conversation stopped as completely as if a switch had been thrown. Julian lowered the champagne bottle. His expression moved through surprise, confusion, and calculation in rapid, visible sequence, each one lasting less than a second before the professional composure reasserted itself. But the sequence had been there. Marcus had seen it. "How did you—" Julian began. The boardroom doors opened again, behind Marcus. Both of them. Together. Hard. The sound of it was sharp and final, the sound of something that had been building for a very long time, arriving all at once. Sarah walked in. She was not alone. 2 federal agents in dark jackets came through the doors behind her, badges clipped at their belts, moving with the calm, purposeful economy of people who had done this many times and felt nothing about doing it again. Sarah stopped beside Marcus. She looked at Julian. She looked at him the way investigators look at subjects they have spent months studying, with the particular flat attention of someone who knows everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. Julian set the champagne bottle down. It touched the mahogany table with a small, careful sound. "Julian Hartwell," Sarah said. Her voice was even professional and entirely without theater. "FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest on federal charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice." The room was very quiet. Chloe had stopped laughing. She stood beside Julian's chair with both hands at her sides, her face a precise, frozen arrangement of disbelief. One of the junior executives pushed back from the table slightly, an involuntary motion, the body's instinct to create distance from something dangerous. Julian looked at Sarah. He looked at the federal agents. He looked at Marcus. His composure was still largely intact. It was extraordinary, actually, how much of it remained. The composure of a man who had spent years building walls between himself and consequence, and still even now could not quite believe that the walls were gone. "I want my attorney," Julian said. "That's your right," Sarah said. She nodded to one of the agents. Marcus reached into the inside of his faded uniform jacket. His hand found the inner lining, the false panel along the left seam, stitched shut for 11 weeks and open now with a single, precise pull. He drew out what was inside. A badge. Federal gold, matte finished, set in worn leather. The leather was battered at the corners from years of being carried in exactly this position, against exactly this side of exactly this jacket. He held it open. He held it toward the room. The executives looked at it. Chloe looked at it. Julian looked at it. The room looked at Marcus, at the faded uniform jacket, and the scuffed boots, and the cracked thermos on his desk downstairs, and the battered laptop, and 11 weeks of overnight shifts, and a limp that had never once slowed him down. And they looked at the federal gold badge in his open hand, and the silence in that room was not the silence of shock. It was something deeper. The silence of a very large and expensive structure discovering all at once that its foundation had been wrong. Marcus looked at Julian. "Marcus Webb," he said. His voice was quiet, even entirely without performance. "Special Agent Financial Crimes Unit. I've been embedded here for 11 weeks. Julian's champagne flute slipped. His fingers steady through everything, through the board meeting and the planted evidence in the holding room, and the champagne finally lost their grip. The crystal hit the marble floor. It shattered into a bright, violent spray champagne and glass spreading outward across the polished surface in a wide, irreversible arc. Nobody moved to clean it up. On the far wall of the boardroom, the main projector flickered. Once, twice, then it came on. The solitaire interface loaded. The familiar bright cards appeared for exactly 1 second. Then they dissolved. In their place, cascading lines of green code filled the massive screen, dense and rapid, scrolling downward in real-time account numbers and transfer records and shell entity registrations and routing data, all of it, decoding all of it, resolving all of it, becoming legible and permanent and entirely irreversibly on the record. Julian's offshore architecture, built over 3 years, hidden beneath 6 layers of digital infrastructure, was on the boardroom projector for every executive, every attorney, every federal agent, and every camera in the room to see. Julian watched it. He watched his own work. He watched every careful, expensive, meticulous construction of the last 3 years appear on a screen the size of a wall and unmake itself in real time, green and precise and unstoppable. His face finally let go. The composure went. Not all at once. In pieces. Like something structural giving way under a load it was never actually built to carry. Sarah nodded again. The federal agents moved. Julian did not run. He did not shout. He stood at the head of his mahogany table in his charcoal suit with his rolled sleeves and his Rolex and the champagne spreading around the shattered crystal at his feet, and he stood there while the agents reached him and the room watched, and the green code scrolled on. And Marcus stood near the door with his badge open in his hand and his bad leg steady beneath him, and his face as it had been from the beginning perfectly still. They let Marcus sit in Julian's chair. Nobody said he could. Nobody said he couldn't. The federal agents were processing Julian near the boardroom doors, and Sarah was on her phone, low and precise, coordinating with the field office, and the remaining executives had retreated to the far end of the table in a tight, quiet cluster. And nobody was looking at the chair. So Marcus walked to it, he pulled it out, he sat down. It was a very good chair. Deep leather, perfectly weighted, the kind of chair that had been selected by someone who understood that furniture communicated power as clearly as anything else in a room. Marcus sat in it the way he sat in his security desk chair, evenly, without performance. His bad leg extended slightly, the cold from the basement still working its way out of the scar tissue, slow and familiar. He set his hands on the mahogany table. He looked at the projector screen. The green code was still scrolling. Account after account, transfer after transfer, 3 years of careful, expensive architecture dissolving in real time into plain, legible, prosecutable fact. The numbers were extraordinary. Marcus had known they would be. He had watched them accumulate transaction by transaction over 11 weeks of overnight shifts. Watching them on the boardroom screen was different. There was something clarifying about seeing the full scope of a thing at once, rather than in pieces. Julian was on his knees. It had not been a dramatic fall. One of the agents had applied the standard practiced pressure to the back of Julian's legs, and Julian had gone down the way. Tall structures go down suddenly and without elegance, his charcoal suit trousers making contact with the marble floor, his Rolex catching the light one final time as his arms were drawn behind him. The handcuffs were standard federal issue. Cold steel mat finished utterly without distinction. They closed around Julian's wrists with a sound that was small in the large room but landed with the particular weight of something final. The click of them echoed off the glass walls. It traveled the length of the boardroom and came back. Julian heard it twice. His Rolex was removed. Standard procedure, Sarah explained in her even, professional voice. Personal effects documented and held. The agent placed it in an evidence bag. The platinum caught the light through the plastic. $50,000 of watchmaking sealed in a Ziploc bag labeled with a case number. Julian looked at it. His face was not the face he had worn in this room 2 hours ago. That face was gone. What remained was something older and smaller and without the careful architecture of contempt that had made Julian Hartwell, CFO, so very recognizable. What remained was just a man on his knees on a marble floor, watching his watch disappear into an evidence bag, understanding perhaps for the first time that the distance between the chair at the head of the table and the floor beside it was not as permanent as he had always assumed. "Please," Julian said. His voice was quiet. It was the quietest Marcus had ever heard it. "I can make this manageable. There are accounts you haven't found. I can cooperate. I can give you names, structures, the full network." Sarah looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment with the flat, patient attention of someone who had heard this specific sentence in this specific tone more times than she could count. "You'll have the opportunity to speak with your attorney," she said. She looked at the agents. They lifted Julian. He rose from the floor without grace, his hands behind him, his charcoal suit creased at the knees, his collar slightly open, his face still working through the mathematics of a situation that was no longer solvable by the methods available to him. The agents walked him toward the boardroom doors. He passed the length of the mahogany table. He passed the shattered champagne flute still on the floor, the liquid spread and drying at the edges. He passed the projector screen, still green, still scrolling, still dismantling everything he had built with patient, indifferent precision. He passed Marcus. He stopped. The agents paused. Julian looked at Marcus in the leather chair, hands flat on the mahogany table, faded uniform jacket, scuffed boots, bad leg extended, face still. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he has spent a long time not seeing, and is only now too late beginning to understand the shape of. Marcus looked back at him. His expression did not change. It was the same expression he had worn in the lobby on the first night, the same expression he had worn when Julian knocked over his thermos, and when Chloe told him he had missed a spot, and when the corporate guards took his arms in the boardroom, and when Julian stood in the holding room and held up a phone screen full of stolen money and called him a useful prop. Still. Quiet. Completely, entirely present. Julian opened his mouth. He closed it. He had nothing left that was worth saying. The agents moved him forward. The boardroom doors opened. He went through them. The doors swung closed. The corridor swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Then there was nothing. Chloe was still in the room. She had not moved from her position beside Julian's chair for the entire duration of the arrest. She stood there now in the aftermath, her posture no longer straight, her careful practiced composure entirely gone. Her face, the face of a person who has organized their entire professional identity around a proximity to power that has just been permanently revoked. Sarah looked at her. "We'll need your full cooperation," Sarah said. "Everything you observed, everything you facilitated, everything you knew, and when you knew it." Chloe looked at the table. On it, scattered where Julian had dropped them in the chaos of the arrest, were the documents from the manila envelope, the forged offshore bank records, the crisp, thick, official-looking papers that had been pressed into Marcus's locker with such careful, deliberate hands. Chloe bent down, slowly, without a word. She began gathering them. Her hands were not steady. The papers shifted and slipped, and she gathered them again, her movements small and effortful, her heels no longer sharp on the floor, her breath slightly audible in the quiet room. Marcus watched her. He watched her the way he had watched everything in this building, steadily, without judgment, without satisfaction, with the particular quality of attention that simply records what is true. Then he looked away. He looked at the projector screen. The green code had slowed. The last of the accounts were resolving, the final transfer surfacing and locking into the record, the architecture complete. The screen held the data for a long moment, bright and precise and total. Then it went dark. The boardroom was quiet. The marble floor gleamed. The champagne had dried at the edges of the shattered crystal, the spread of it smaller, now contracting. The mahogany table reflected the overhead lights in a long, dark mirror. Marcus sat in the leather chair and looked at the dark screen and said nothing for a while. Sarah finished her call. She walked to the table. She stood across from Marcus and looked at him with the expression of someone who has worked alongside a person for 11 weeks at a careful, necessary distance, and is now for the first time in the same room with them without the operational requirement to pretend otherwise. "Clean finish," she said. "Cleaner than most." Marcus looked at her. "He made it easy," Marcus said. "They usually do." Sarah looked at the dark projector screen. She looked at the evidence bag on the table where Julian's Rolex sat behind plastic mat and diminished. She looked at the boardroom doors. "Transport's outside," she said. "You need anything before debrief." Marcus looked at his hands on the mahogany table. He looked at the scuffed, steel-toed boots on the marble floor. He looked at the federal gold badge still open beside his right hand, the leather worn at the corners, the gold mat from years of being carried against a body that had taken it into places this building could not have imagined. He closed the badge. He slid it into his jacket pocket. He pressed both hands flat on the table. He stood, his bad legs straightened slowly, the last of the cold working out of the scar tissue. The familiar ache receding to its usual background, register the one he had stopped noticing years ago. Because some things become so constant, they stop being a sensation and become simply a part of the way you move through the world. He picked up nothing. He left Julian's chair exactly where it was. He walked to the boardroom doors. He pushed them open. The corridor outside was bright and empty and very quiet. His steel-toed boots were steady on the floor. He did not look back. True power had never needed to. You can feel the absolute burning vindication in your chest right now, watching that loud corporate arrogance get completely dismantled. If you were in Marcus's shoes, looking at the man who tried to steal your freedom for his own greed, would you have shown him a single ounce of mercy, or did he get exactly the explosive karma he earned? Drop your verdict in the comments below. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest person is often the strongest, and I'll see you in part 2.